Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to another exciting episode on the English Globe, where we help you improve your English while learning about the most important topics from history and around the world. Whether you're at home, walking outside, or riding the bus, we're so happy you're spending your valuable time with us today, and we promise to give you an amazing learning experience filled with knowledge, curiosity, and clear English that is easy to follow.
That's right, Adam. Today we are going to explore one of the most powerful and dramatic periods in modern history. The topic of this episode is the Cold War, America versus the Soviet Union, and it's something everyone should know about, not just because it shaped the entire second half of the 20th century, but also because its effects can still be felt in international politics, military power, technology, and global relationships even today, in the 21st century.
So, what exactly was the Cold War? Why is it called a Cold War? And what happened between the United States and the Soviet Union that made the world live in fear for so many decades? These are the questions we'll be answering step by step in this long and informative episode, and by the end of it, you will have a very clear understanding of what the Cold War was, why it began, what events defined it, and how it finally came to an end after more than 40 years.
Yes, and we're not just going to give you boring facts or dates. Our goal is to take you on a journey, to help you imagine what people felt at that time, to understand the fear of nuclear war, to explore how the two superpowers, America and the Soviet Union, competed not only with weapons, but with ideas, technology, and influence over other countries across the world, from Asia to Europe to Latin America and beyond.
We'll talk about spies and secrets, about missiles and diplomacy, about powerful leaders like John F. Kennedy and Mikhail Gorbachev, and about how people in 1984, both the East and West, lived under the shadow of a war that never became a real direct battle, but which was always just one wrong decision away from disaster. And through this story, you'll also learn dozens of useful English phrases and expressions in a very natural way.
So, dear listeners, before we dive into this fascinating journey through the Cold War, we want to ask you for a small favor. If you're enjoying these English history podcasts, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The English Globe. It helps us continue making more content for you, and it lets YouTube know that English learners like you are interested in history, knowledge, and improving their skills.
Also, we would really love to know more about you. Please tell us in the comments, where are you listening from? Are you in Asia, Africa, Europe, or somewhere else? We love hearing from our global family of learners. And have you heard about the Cold War before? Maybe you've studied it in school, or seen it in a movie, or maybe you're hearing about it now for the first time. Share your opinion or ideas about the Cold War in the comments below.
Yes, don't be shy. We read every comment, and we're always happy to learn from your thoughts and perspectives. Some of you have amazing insights, and we love it when you share your culture, your experiences, and even your questions. And who knows, maybe your comment will inspire a future episode. So again, like, subscribe, and tell us your thoughts.
Now, are you ready to begin this journey? In the next section, we're going to look at how the Cold War really started. We'll go back in time to the end of World War II, when the United States and the Soviet Union were actually allies fighting against Nazi Germany. But very quickly, things changed, and those friendly allies became powerful enemies locked in a silent but dangerous battle that would last for decades.
We'll talk about the key differences between these two countries, how one believed in capitalism and democracy, and the other followed communism and a one-party system. We'll also look at how these differences created suspicion, fear, and tension that spread across the world. So stay with us as we begin to explore the roots of the Cold War, coming up next in Section 2.
And remember, this is not just a history lesson. This is your English practice, your global awareness, and your personal growth all in one. Let's continue learning, thinking, and connecting through stories that really matter. Are you ready? Let's go. All right, dear listeners, now that we've introduced the Cold War and explained why it's such an important part of modern history, it's time to dive deeper into the story and understand how this global rivalry really began. To do that, we need to go back to the final years of World War II, a time when the world was still fighting against Nazi Germany and Japan, and when two powerful nations, the United States and the Soviet Union, were actually working together as allies.
Yes, that's right. It might surprise some people to know that during World War II, the USA and the Soviet Union were on the same side, fighting a common enemy. They were both part of what was called the Allied Powers, along with the United Kingdom, France, and other nations. Together, they helped defeat Hitler's army and end the war in Europe in 1945. But even though they worked together during the war, there were already big differences between them in terms of politics, economy, and beliefs.
The United States believed in capitalism, where businesses are privately owned, people can vote for their leaders, and there is freedom of speech, religion, and press. On the other side, the Soviet Union followed communism, a system where the government controlled most of the economy, there was only one political party, and people had less personal freedom. These two systems were very different, and that made it hard for the USA and USSR to trust each other, even as allies.
Exactly. The leaders of both countries, President Franklin D. Roosevelt from the USA and Joseph Stalin from the Soviet Union, knew they had to work together to defeat the Nazis, but they didn't really trust each other. Even while they were fighting on the same side, both countries were thinking about what the world would look like after the war. And both of them wanted to shape that future in a way that matched their own ideas and interests.
As the war was coming to an end, the Allied leaders held important meetings to discuss how to rebuild Europe and manage peace. These meetings were known as the Yalta Conference in February 1945 and the Potsdam Conference in July 1945. At these conferences, leaders from the USA, the UK, and the Soviet Union met to make decisions about things like dividing Germany, rebuilding Europe, and how to handle Japan's defeat in Asia.
But instead of solving the problems, these meetings actually created more tension. The leaders made agreements, but they didn't fully trust each other to keep their promises. For example, at Yalta, Stalin agreed to let Eastern European countries have free elections. But later, the Soviet Union did not allow real democracy in those countries. Instead, Stalin placed communist governments in power in places like Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria.
This made the United States and its Western allies very worried. They saw the Soviet Union taking control of Eastern Europe, spreading communism, and creating what Winston Churchill later called the Iron Curtain, a metaphor for the divide between free Western countries and communist Eastern countries. The world was starting to break into two sides, one led by the United States, supporting democracy and capitalism, and the other led by the Soviet Union, promoting communism and government control.
And this division created deep suspicion between the two superpowers. The USA feared that the Soviet Union wanted to spread communism across the world and destroy democracy. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, believed that the USA wanted to surround it with military alliances and crush the Soviet system. Both sides were afraid, and both sides believed they were defending their way of life. This fear and mistrust laid the foundation for the Cold War.
It's important to remember that the Cold War didn't start with one single event. It was a slow process that grew out of years of disagreement, fear, and broken promises. It began with small tensions over Eastern Europe, but it quickly turned into a global competition for power, influence, and control. It became a race between two different visions of how the world should work: freedom and markets versus control and equality.
And that's what makes this part of history so powerful to learn. It wasn't just about governments or armies. It was about two very different ideas fighting to shape the future of the entire planet. and people on both sides believed deeply in their values. That's why the Cold War was so intense, even without direct fighting between the two nations. It was a war of ideas, a war of influence, and a war of fear that lasted for more than 40 years.
In the next section, we'll go deeper into this idea of the Iron Curtain and explain how Europe became divided between East and West. We'll talk about how countries were controlled, how borders were closed, and how the division of Germany, especially the city of Berlin, became one of the most powerful symbols of the Cold War. So, stay with us, because the story is just getting started.
Yes, and if you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the English Globe for more English podcasts, just like this one. And remember to tell us in the comments what you think. Did you know about the Cold War before? Have you learned something new today? And where in the world are you listening from? We can't wait to hear from you.
Thanks for staying with us. Now let's move forward and explore how Europe was split in two after World War II, and how the Cold War created walls, both physical and emotional, between people, nations, and ideas. That's coming up next in Section 3, the Iron Curtain and the Division of Europe. In the last section, we explored how tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union slowly increased after World War II, even though they had been allies during the war. We talked about how mistrust, fear, and differences in ideology began to separate these two powerful nations. Now, in this section, we're going to look at how this growing tension physically and politically divided Europe, creating one of the most famous symbols of the Cold War, the Iron Curtain.
That's right, Adam. After World War II ended in 1945, much of Europe was destroyed and needed to be rebuilt. But instead of coming together to help the continent recover as a united group, the Western Allies and the Soviet Union had very different plans for Europe's future. The countries in Western Europe wanted democracy, free markets, and open societies, while the Soviet Union focused on building strong communist governments in the eastern part of the continent under Soviet influence and control.
One of the most important countries in this story is Germany. After the war, Germany was divided into 4 zones, each controlled by one of the 4 Allied powers: the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union. The capital city, Berlin, was also divided, even though it was located deep inside the Soviet zone. At first, these zones were supposed to be temporary, but disagreements between the Allies and the Soviets made the division permanent, and Germany became a key battlefield in the Cold War.
In 1949, the 3 western zones of Germany, controlled by the US, UK, and France, joined together to create a new country called the Federal Republic of Germany, commonly known as West Germany. It was democratic, capitalist, and supported by the Western powers. In response, the Soviet Union created its own version, the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany, which was communist and under strict Soviet control. This marked the official political division of Germany and the beginning of 2 very different ways of life.
And Berlin, the capital city, became a powerful symbol of this division. Although Berlin was supposed to be shared between the 4 Allied powers, it ended up being divided in half: West Berlin, which was controlled by the Western Allies, and East Berlin, which was under Soviet control. Even though West Berlin was inside East Germany, it remained a tiny island of freedom and democracy surrounded by communist territory. This situation made Berlin one of the most tense and dangerous places in the entire Cold War.
In 1946, Winston Churchill, the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, gave a famous speech in which he said, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent." This was the first time the term Iron Curtain was used to describe the separation between the free countries of Western Europe and the communist-controlled countries of Eastern Europe. It wasn't a real curtain, of course. It was a political and military boundary that split the continent in 2.
Behind this Iron Curtain, Countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania were all controlled by communist parties that were loyal to Moscow. These countries did not have free elections, freedom of speech, or independent governments. They were often ruled by fear, with secret police watching citizens, strict censorship of the media, and no permission to criticize the government. The Soviet Union wanted to keep these countries under its control to protect itself from any future Western attack.
Meanwhile, the countries in Western Europe were working together to rebuild their economies with the help of the United States. In 1947, the US introduced the Marshall Plan, a huge program that gave billions of dollars in aid to Western European countries to help them recover from the war. This made the Soviet Union even more suspicious because it saw the Marshall Plan as a way for the US to gain influence and power in Europe by buying loyalty from the countries it helped.
In response to these Western actions, the Soviet Union blocked access to West Berlin in 1948, trying to force the Allies to leave the city. This led to the Berlin blockade, one of the first major crises of the Cold War. But instead of giving up, the United States and its allies organized the Berlin airlift, flying food, fuel, and supplies into West Berlin for almost a year. Hundreds of planes landed every day, showing the world that the West would not allow the Soviets to take control of the city.
Eventually, the Soviet Union ended the blockade in 1949, but Berlin remained a divided city and a powerful symbol of the Cold War. In 1961, the situation became even more dramatic when East Germany, with Soviet support, built a wall, known as the Berlin Wall, to completely seal off East Berlin from West Berlin. This wall was more than just bricks and concrete. It was a physical barrier that tore families apart, stopped people from escaping, and reminded the world that the Cold War was very real.
The Berlin Wall stretched over 150 kilometers, with guard towers, barbed wire, and armed soldiers. It wasn't just to keep people out, it was to keep people in. Many East Germans wanted to leave and live in the freer, more prosperous West, but the communist government didn't allow it. Thousands of people tried to escape over the wall, and many of them were killed in the attempt. The wall became a tragic symbol of how deeply the world had been divided by fear and ideology.
And it wasn't only Berlin that was affected. All across Europe, countries were divided, and families were separated by borders, fences, and ideology. In the West, people were free to vote, travel, and speak their minds. In the East, many people lived under strict government control with limited freedom and constant surveillance. The Iron Curtain was not just a political line, it was a daily reality for millions of people, shaping their hopes, dreams, and fears.
So, as you can see, dear listeners, the Cold War was not just about distant threats or political speeches, it was about real people living real lives on both sides of the divide. It was about cities split in half, children growing up behind walls, and families separated by systems they didn't choose. And while the leaders talked about missiles and alliances, ordinary people simply wanted peace, freedom, and the chance to live without fear.
In the next section of this podcast, we will talk about one of the most dangerous and terrifying parts of the Cold War, the nuclear arms race. We'll explain how both sides built more and more powerful weapons, why they believed it would stop war, and how the world came closer than ever to nuclear disaster. It's a dark but important part of the story, so don't miss it.
And before we go, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the English Globe, and tell us your thoughts in the comments. Do you know someone whose life was affected by the Berlin Wall or the Cold War? Have you ever visited Berlin or studied this history in school? And of course, where are you listening from today? We love hearing from you.
Thank you for being with us today. We hope this journey is helping you improve your English and expand your understanding of the world. Stay with us. There's much more to learn. As the Cold War deepened, one of the most frightening parts of the conflict was the arms race, a dangerous and expensive competition between the United States and the Soviet Union to build the largest and most powerful collection of weapons, especially nuclear weapons. This wasn't just about military strength. It was about fear, survival, and the belief that only by being stronger than the enemy could a country truly protect itself from attack or destruction.
The arms race officially began in 1945, when the United States became the first and only country in history to use atomic bombs during war, dropping 2 nuclear bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki to force Japan to surrender and end World War II. These bombings shocked the world and showed the terrifying power of nuclear weapons, with tens of thousands of people killed instantly and many more suffering from radiation for years afterward.
At that time, the United States had a monopoly on nuclear technology, but this did not last long. In 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested its own atomic bomb, making it clear that the world now had 2 nuclear-armed superpowers. This created a new kind of fear, the fear that a war between the USA and USSR would not just involve soldiers and tanks, but massive explosions capable of destroying entire cities, killing millions, and leaving the Earth poisoned and unlivable.
As technology advanced, both sides began developing even more powerful weapons. In 1952, the United States tested the hydrogen bomb, or H-bomb, which was much stronger than the original atomic bombs. Just 1 year later, in 1953, the Soviet Union tested its own version of the hydrogen bomb. The race was no longer just about having nuclear weapons, it was about having more, having bigger, and having faster ways to deliver them across the world in case of war.
This led to the creation of intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, which could carry nuclear warheads from one continent to another in less than an hour. Submarines were also armed with nuclear missiles, and bombers were ready to fly at a moment's notice. At the height of the Cold War, both countries had thousands of nuclear weapons aimed at each other, enough to destroy the world many times over. This terrifying situation became known as Mutually Assured Destruction, or MAD.
MAD was a strange and dangerous idea. It meant that neither side would dare to start a nuclear war, because doing so would lead to their own destruction as well. If one side launched a nuclear attack, the other side would respond with even more missiles, leading to total destruction for both. In a way, MAD prevented war by making the cost of war too high. But it also meant that the world lived under constant fear that one mistake, one false alarm, or one act of aggression could end life as we know it.
This fear became very real during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, one of the most dangerous moments in human history. The crisis began when the United States discovered that the Soviet Union was secretly placing nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the coast of Florida. These missiles could reach American cities in minutes, and the US government saw this as a direct threat to national security. President John F. Kennedy demanded that the missiles be removed immediately.
For 13 terrifying days in October 1962, the world watched as the United States and the Soviet Union moved closer and closer to nuclear war. American warships surrounded Cuba, Soviet ships were on their way with more equipment, and both countries prepared their nuclear forces. People around the world feared that this would be the end, that one wrong move could lead to the firing of missiles and the death of millions. It was the closest the world ever came to full-scale nuclear conflict.
Fortunately, the crisis ended peacefully. The Soviet Union agreed to remove its missiles from Cuba, and in return the United States promised not to invade Cuba and secretly agreed to remove its own missiles from Turkey. This event showed just how dangerous the Cold War had become and how important diplomacy and communication were in preventing disaster. It also led to the creation of a special telephone line between Washington and Moscow, known as the Hotline, to allow quick communication in future emergencies.
Even though the Cuban Missile Crisis ended without war, it did not stop the arms race. Both countries continued building and testing new nuclear weapons, improving their military technology, and spending billions of dollars on defense. This massive military buildup had a huge cost, not only in money, but in the psychological health of people who lived in fear. In schools across the United States, children practiced duck and cover drills, hiding under desks as if that could protect them from a nuclear blast.
In the Soviet Union, the government built underground shelters and warned people about the dangers of the West. Propaganda was used on both sides to make citizens believe that the enemy was evil, dangerous, and planning an attack at any moment. Films, posters, and speeches were designed to keep people afraid and obedient, always ready for war. This fear became part of everyday life and affected how people thought, how they lived, and even how they dreamed.
But despite the fear and the buildup of weapons, there were also efforts to reduce tension. Over time, leaders from both countries began to realize that they needed to control the arms race and reduce the risk of accidental war. They started signing agreements like the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 1963, which banned testing nuclear weapons in the atmosphere, and later, the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, known as SALT, which aimed to freeze the number of certain types of weapons.
These agreements were small steps, but they showed that even during the darkest moments of the Cold War, there was still hope for peace. People on both sides of the Iron Curtain wanted to live, not to die. They wanted safety, not destruction. They wanted their children to grow up in a world without mushroom clouds, radioactive fallout, or the endless fear of total war. And slowly, that desire helped create moments of understanding and progress between the superpowers.
Still, the arms race continued for many more years, with both the United States and the Soviet Union always trying to be one step ahead. It was like a giant, dangerous game, where the players never met on the battlefield but always prepared for the worst. The Cold War was not just cold in the sense that it wasn't a shooting war. It was cold because it was filled with silence, suspicion, and the constant threat of a nuclear winter that could end all life on Earth.
In our next section, we'll look at another way the Cold War was fought, not with bombs or bullets, but with proxy wars around the world. We'll explain how the USA and USSR supported different sides in other countries' conflicts, turning local wars into global battles for influence and ideology. From Korea to Vietnam to Africa and Latin America, the Cold War was everywhere. So stay tuned, because this journey is far from over. Although the United States and the Soviet Union never fought each other directly during the Cold War, they were still involved in many real wars around the world, but in a hidden or indirect way. These wars are known as proxy wars, which means that the two superpowers supported different sides in smaller conflicts, using money, weapons, and training to spread their influence and fight for their ideologies without officially going to war with each other.
Proxy wars became one of the most common and deadly features of the Cold War. In these wars, local groups or governments would receive support from either the United States of America or the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, depending on whether they were fighting for democracy and capitalism or for communism and socialist revolution. These battles were often long and bloody, with thousands or even millions of lives lost, and the people who suffered the most were usually not from the superpowers, but from the countries caught in the middle.
One of the earliest and most important proxy wars was the Korean War, which began in 1950. After World War II, Korea had been divided into two parts. North Korea, which was supported by the Soviet Union and followed a communist system, and South Korea, which was supported by the United States and followed a capitalist democracy. In 1950, North Korea invaded the South, hoping to reunite the country under communist rule, and this led to a full-scale war.
The United States, under the flag of the United Nations, sent troops to help defend South Korea, while China, with support from the Soviet Union, helped North Korea. The war lasted for 3 years and caused massive destruction. In the end, a ceasefire was declared in 1953, and the border between North and South Korea stayed almost the same. Even today, the two countries are still officially at war, and the Korean peninsula remains one of the most tense places in the world.
Another major and even more controversial proxy war was the Vietnam War, which became one of the longest and most painful conflicts of the Cold War. Like Korea, Vietnam was divided into a communist North, supported by the Soviet Union and China, and a non-communist South, supported by the United States. The US government believed in something called the domino theory, the idea that if one country became communist, others in the region would follow.
Because of this belief, the United States sent hundreds of thousands of soldiers to fight in Vietnam to stop the spread of communism. The war lasted from the early 1960s to 1975 and became deeply unpopular, especially in the United States, where people protested against it, calling it unnecessary and cruel. In the end, the United States withdrew its troops, and communist forces from the North took control of the whole country. Vietnam became one of the few proxy wars where the Soviet side clearly won.
But the fighting didn't stop there. Proxy wars happened all over the globe, especially in Latin America, Africa, and parts of Asia. In Afghanistan, for example, the Soviet Union invaded the country in 1979 to support a communist government that was in danger of being overthrown. In response, the United States supported the Mujahideen, a group of Islamic fighters who resisted Soviet occupation. This conflict lasted for almost 10 years and was called the Soviet-Afghan War.
The Soviet-Afghan War was often called the Soviet Union's Vietnam because it was long, expensive, and very difficult for the Soviet military. It drained Soviet resources, caused the death of many soldiers, and damaged the USSR's image around the world. Many historians believe that the failure in Afghanistan played a major role in the weakening and eventual collapse of the Soviet Union in the late 1980s and early 1990s.
In Latin America, the United States supported anti-communist governments and rebel groups, often using secret operations run by the CIA to overthrow or weaken leftist leaders. In countries like Chile, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Cuba, Cold War tensions were deeply felt. One of the most famous cases was Cuba, where a communist revolution led by Fidel Castro in 1959 brought the island nation into the Soviet camp, right on America's doorstep.
This led to several major events, including the Bay of Pigs invasion, where the U.S. tried and failed to remove Castro, and the Cuban Missile Crisis, which we discussed earlier. In Nicaragua, the U.S. supported a group called the Contras to fight against the leftist Sandinista government. These conflicts were often very complex, with many innocent civilians caught in the middle, suffering from violence, poverty, and political instability for years.
In Africa, the Cold War turned many civil wars into proxy conflicts. For example, in Angola, after gaining independence from Portugal, a civil war broke out between different groups. The Soviet Union and Cuba supported the MPLA, a Marxist group, while the United States and South Africa supported opposing factions like UNITA. These battles were often not just about ideology, but also about controlling natural resources and gaining political influence in the region.
The tragedy of proxy wars is that while the superpowers used them as tools in their global chess game, the people in those countries paid the price with their lives, their homes, and their futures. Many of these nations are still recovering today from the damage caused by Cold War-era conflicts. The superpowers treated these regions like battlegrounds for ideas, but for the people living there, it was real war, with real blood, pain, and loss.
What makes these proxy wars even more painful is that most of them didn't lead to clear victories or long-term peace. Instead, they left behind divided societies, destroyed infrastructure, and generations of trauma. And while the Cold War may have officially ended in 1991, many of the problems created by these wars still affect global politics today, from ongoing violence to poverty, migration, and weak governments that struggle to recover from decades of conflict.
These wars remind us that the Cold War was not truly cold for millions of people. While the leaders in Washington and Moscow sat in comfortable offices discussing strategies and ideologies, people in Asia, Africa, and Latin America were losing their homes, their families, and sometimes their lives. Understanding these stories helps us see the full picture of what the Cold War meant, not just for the superpowers, but for the entire world.
In our next section, we'll take a break from war and talk about everyday life during the Cold War. What was it like to live in the United States or the Soviet Union during this time? How did people think, feel, and behave? What role did propaganda, education, and fear play in daily life? We'll explore the human side of this conflict and show you what life was really like under the shadow of global tension.
While the Cold War was a global conflict filled with weapons, politics, and battles for influence, it was also something that touched the daily lives of ordinary people. Whether you lived in the United States, the Soviet Union, or somewhere in between, the Cold War shaped how you thought, what you believed, and even what you feared. This wasn't just a fight between governments, it was a constant part of daily life, from the classroom to the dinner table, and from the newspapers to the television screen.
In the United States, fear of a Soviet attack became a regular part of life, especially after the Soviet Union developed nuclear weapons. The government created public safety campaigns that taught people how to survive a nuclear explosion, even though, in reality, survival was unlikely. One of the most famous examples was the duck and cover drill, where children in schools were told to hide under their desks during a nuclear emergency. These drills were practiced regularly, creating a sense of fear and helplessness.
In homes across America, families built bomb shelters in their backyards or basements, storing food, water, and supplies in case of a nuclear war. Civil defense messages on TV and radio reminded people to stay alert, and newspapers reported on international tensions as if disaster could happen at any moment. The constant threat of war led to anxiety, and many people grew up with the belief that the world could end at any time because of a decision made far away in Washington or Moscow.
This fear also spread into American culture. Hollywood movies and television shows during the Cold War often showed evil communist spies, secret weapons, or dramatic battles between good and evil. Films like Red Dawn, Dr. Strangelove, and even science fiction stories used Cold War themes to reflect the public's worry about Soviet invasion, nuclear war, or government secrecy. Popular culture became a mirror of the nation's fears, often exaggerating or simplifying the complex issues behind them.
In the Soviet Union, life was also shaped by Cold War tension, but in different ways. The government strictly controlled all information, and citizens were constantly surrounded by propaganda that promoted the power of the Soviet system and the danger of the West. Posters, newspapers, films, and radio programs praised the Communist Party and warned people not to trust foreigners or capitalist ideas. Children were taught from an early age that the United States wanted to destroy the Soviet way of life.
The education system in the USSR was designed to produce loyal, obedient citizens who believed in the government's message. History books were rewritten to fit political goals, and people who criticized the government were punished, sometimes by being sent to prison camps or losing their jobs. Even in everyday conversations, people were careful not to speak too openly. Neighbors, co-workers, or even family members might report them to the secret police for saying the wrong thing or asking too many questions.
At the same time, many Soviet citizens were proud of their achievements, especially in areas like space exploration, science, and military strength. They saw their country as a powerful force for equality and justice in the world, standing up to the capitalist West. The government promised a future where everyone would be equal, with jobs, housing, and education for all. While life could be difficult, especially with shortages of goods, many people believed they were part of a great mission.
In both the United States and the Soviet Union, youth played a very important role in shaping the future. In America, young people were taught to believe in freedom, democracy, and the dangers of communism. In the USSR, young students joined organizations like the Young Pioneers, where they learned loyalty to the state and pride in being Soviet citizens. Both countries raised their children to believe they were on the right side of history and that the other side was dangerous, wrong, or evil.
This way of thinking created a deep sense of us versus them. People in both countries saw the other side not just as a rival, but as a threat to their way of life. This made it harder to understand each other, or to imagine peace. And even though ordinary citizens in both the USA and USSR had more in common than they realized, such as wanting a better life, a good future for their children, and peace, these similarities were often hidden by fear, suspicion, and official messaging.
Even in Europe, life during the Cold War was divided. In the West, countries like France, the UK, and West Germany had more freedom and access to American culture. In the East, under Soviet control, people lived in societies where the government controlled many aspects of life, from what you could say to what you could watch to where you could travel. Many people in Eastern Europe wanted to escape, but strict border controls and the Berlin Wall made it almost impossible.
The Cold War also affected jobs and education. In both the USA and USSR, schools focused on science, math, and technology, especially during the space race, and governments invested heavily in producing skilled workers who could help win the competition. In the Soviet Union, universities were free but controlled by the state. In the US, many new programs were created to support science education and develop national defense through research and innovation.
Religion was another area of difference. In the United States, religious freedom was protected, and many Americans saw their country as being guided by spiritual values. In the Soviet Union, however, the government was officially atheist and discouraged religious practice. Churches were closed or controlled, and religious leaders were watched carefully. This added another layer of tension between the two superpowers, as religion became one more sign of the differences in how they saw the world.
One interesting part of Cold War life was how much people on each side misunderstood each other. Many Americans believed that Soviet citizens were brainwashed or completely controlled by their government, while many Soviets believed that Americans were greedy, selfish, and living in cities full of crime and racism. These ideas were often exaggerated or completely false, but they were repeated so often in newspapers, schools, and media that people believed them without question.
Despite all of this, some individuals tried to reach across the divide. Artists, scientists, athletes, and even students sometimes traveled or exchanged letters with people from the other side. Events like the Olympic Games became chances for both competition and cultural exchange. In these rare moments, people could see that their so-called enemies were not so different after all, that behind the walls and weapons were human beings just like them, with hopes, dreams, and families.
Living during the Cold War meant always being aware of the global conflict, even if you didn't fully understand it. People made daily choices based on politics, what to say, where to travel, who to trust, what to believe. Life was shaped by fear, but also by determination. On both sides, people tried to live their lives, raise their children, and find meaning in a world divided by walls, missiles, and mistrust. This human experience is a part of Cold War history that should never be forgotten.
In the next section, we'll shift our focus to something more inspiring: the space race. We'll explore how competition between the USA and the USSR led to some of the greatest scientific achievements in human history, including sending the first man into space and landing on the moon. Even in the middle of global tension, these moments reminded the world that human beings can reach for the stars, sometimes literally. So don't miss what comes next.
While the Cold War was filled with tension, fear, and even violence, it also gave rise to one of the most exciting and inspiring competitions in human history: the space race. This was not a war fought with guns or tanks, but with rockets, satellites, and astronauts. It was a race to show which country was more advanced, more innovative, and more capable of leading the future of technology and science on Earth and beyond.
The space race officially began in 1957, when the Soviet Union launched the first man-made satellite into space. It was called Sputnik 1, and it shocked the world. For the first time, a human-made object was orbiting the planet, sending signals back to Earth. This small beeping satellite marked the beginning of a new era and made Americans feel like they were falling behind in science and space technology. The launch of Sputnik was more than just a scientific achievement. It was a powerful political message.
The Soviet Union's success with Sputnik caused fear and concern in the United States. If the USSR could launch a satellite into space, it meant they also had rockets powerful enough to carry nuclear weapons across continents. This led to a major push in the United States to invest more in education, research, and technology. Schools focused more on science and math, and the U.S. government created NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, in 1958 to lead space exploration efforts.
Soon the competition reached new heights. In 1961, the Soviet Union once again made history by sending the first human into space. His name was Yuri Gagarin, and he became an international hero. Gagarin orbited the Earth once, proving that humans could survive in space and return safely. This was a huge victory for the Soviet Union and a proud moment for millions of Soviet citizens who saw their country as the leader of the future.
The United States responded quickly. That same year, American astronaut Alan Shepard became the first American in space, although his flight was much shorter than Gagarin's. But the most ambitious goal was set by President John F. Kennedy, who in 1961 announced that the United States would send a man to the moon and return him safely to Earth before the end of the decade. This bold promise became the driving force behind the American space program and captured the imagination of people around the world.
Over the next 8 years, the United States made rapid progress, launching more astronauts, testing rockets, and solving countless scientific challenges. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union continued its own space missions, achieving several important milestones, including the first woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova, in 1963. The two superpowers competed in every way possible, turning space into a stage for Cold War rivalry and national pride.
Finally, in 1969, the United States achieved what many thought was impossible. On July 20th, Neil Armstrong became the first human to walk on the moon, followed by Buzz Aldrin, while Michael Collins remained in orbit above them. Armstrong's famous words, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," became a symbol of what humanity could achieve through courage, science, and teamwork. It was a major victory for the United States and a moment of global unity and wonder.
The moon landing was watched by millions of people around the world and marked a high point in the space race. After that, the competition slowed down. Both the USA and the USSR had proven their abilities, and the focus shifted toward cooperation. In 1975, the two countries launched the Apollo-Soyuz mission, where American and Soviet spacecraft docked in space and astronauts from both sides worked together. It was a peaceful moment in a long and tense rivalry.
Beyond the political competition, the space race had many positive effects. It led to incredible advancements in science, engineering, and technology. Satellites launched during this time helped create the modern world, making possible things like global communication, weather prediction, and GPS systems. The need to solve complex problems in space pushed both nations to develop new materials, new computers, and new ways of thinking.
The space race also inspired a whole generation of young people to dream big and pursue careers in science and technology. It showed that even in the middle of conflict, human beings could do amazing things. Many people remember the Cold War as a time of fear and division, but the achievements in space remind us that competition can also lead to progress, discovery, and hope for a better future.
It's important to understand that space was more than just a battlefield for Cold War competition. It was also a symbol of human potential. While the United States and the Soviet Union were trying to prove who was stronger, they were also showing what was possible when people worked together to explore the unknown. The space race gave the world its first view of Earth from above, a small blue planet floating in the vastness of space, reminding everyone of our shared humanity.
Even today, the legacy of the space race continues. Countries around the world, including Russia, the United States, China, and India, continue to explore space, build satellites, and send probes to other planets. International cooperation on space missions, like the International Space Station, ISS, shows that former rivals can work together for the good of all. In this way, the space race helped turn a time of competition into a foundation for future unity.
The Cold War pushed both superpowers to compete in every possible way, from building weapons and influencing politics to exploring the stars. While the arms race caused fear, the space race inspired awe. It reminded the world that even in the middle of conflict, there is still room for creativity, courage, and cooperation. And it left behind not just machines and missions, but dreams that continue to grow across generations.
In our next section, we'll take a closer look at the role of spying, intelligence, and secret operations during the Cold War. We'll talk about how both the USA and USSR used spies, codebreakers, and undercover agents to gather information, protect secrets, and outsmart their enemies. The world of espionage was filled with danger, mystery, and sometimes even betrayal, and it played a major role in shaping the Cold War behind the scenes. During the Cold War, while the United States and the Soviet Union competed openly with missiles and rockets, much of their battle took place in secret. Both sides relied heavily on spies, intelligence agents, and covert operations to learn about each other's plans, technology, and weaknesses. This world of espionage was filled with danger, mystery, and sometimes betrayal, and it was a crucial part of the Cold War that most people did not see.
Intelligence agencies like the American CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, and the Soviet KGB, Committee for State Security, became powerful organizations during this time. Their job was to gather information about the enemy without being discovered. Spies worked undercover in foreign countries, stealing secrets, listening to conversations, and sometimes recruiting people inside governments or military organizations to act as informants.
One famous example of Cold War spying was the case of the Cambridge Five, a group of British men who secretly worked for the Soviet Union while holding important positions in the UK government and intelligence services. They passed secret information to the Soviets for many years before being discovered. This spy ring caused a major scandal and showed just how deep the secret battle between East and West could go.
Both the CIA and the KGB used a wide range of techniques to collect intelligence. These included intercepting phone calls and radio messages, using hidden cameras and microphones, and deploying agents to infiltrate enemy organizations. Sometimes, they would try to sabotage the other side by spreading false information or encouraging political unrest in enemy countries. These secret missions could change the course of history without any public knowledge.
One of the most famous covert operations was the CIA's involvement in the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, when the United States tried to support Cuban exiles in an attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro's communist government. The mission failed badly, embarrassing the US government and strengthening Soviet influence in Cuba. This event showed how risky and unpredictable secret operations could be during the Cold War.
At the same time, The Soviets worked hard to spy on the United States and its allies. The KGB had agents in many Western countries, and they focused on stealing military secrets, including information about nuclear weapons and missile technology. They also tried to influence political decisions by supporting friendly politicians or spreading propaganda. This created a world where trust was very limited and suspicion was everywhere.
Technology played an important role in espionage. Both sides developed advanced satellites to take pictures of enemy military bases from space. These spy satellites helped monitor missile launches, troop movements, and secret weapons programs. The information gathered from space was often more reliable and safer than sending human spies behind enemy lines, although spies continued to be essential for many types of intelligence.
Code breaking was another important aspect of Cold War spying. Both countries worked to create secret codes for their communications and to break the enemy's codes. This battle of codes and ciphers went on constantly. One famous example from earlier in the 20th century was the American effort to decode Japanese communications during World War II. During the Cold War, similar efforts continued, with each side trying to gain any advantage by learning what the other was planning.
The world of espionage was also filled with double agents, spies who secretly worked for both sides. These double agents often risked their lives to play dangerous games of deception. Sometimes, they passed false information to their own side or pretended to betray their country to gain trust. The life of a spy was filled with uncertainty, danger, and loneliness, and many were caught or killed during their missions.
Espionage stories from the Cold War have inspired countless books, movies, and television shows. Characters like James Bond, although fictional, reflect the fascination with spies, secret gadgets, and hidden dangers. But the real stories were often even more complex, with personal betrayals, political consequences, and lives forever changed by the secret battle between intelligence agencies.
Beyond spying, both the United States and the Soviet Union used propaganda to influence not only their own citizens, but also people around the world. They spread messages through radio broadcasts, newspapers, films, and even art, trying to show their system as better and the other side as dangerous or evil. This battle for hearts and minds was an important part of the Cold War and helped shape public opinion and international relations.
The fear of espionage led to events like McCarthyism in the United States, where many people were accused of being communist spies or sympathizers without strong evidence. This caused fear, suspicion, and sometimes unfair punishment of innocent people. Similarly, in the Soviet Union, people were often watched closely by secret police, and accusations of espionage could lead to imprisonment or worse.
Despite all the spying, secret missions, and propaganda, the Cold War never exploded into direct, full-scale war between the USA and the Soviet Union. Some historians believe that the careful balance of power, along with the dangers of nuclear weapons and intelligence gathering, helped keep both sides from taking that final step. Espionage was one way of fighting without risking total destruction.
In the next section, we will talk about the important events that led to the end of the Cold War. We will explore how changes in leadership, new ideas, and peaceful negotiations helped bring an end to decades of tension and rivalry. The Cold War eventually came to a close, not with a battle, but with agreements, dialogue, and the hope for a better future.
After nearly 50 years of tension, competition, and fear, the Cold War finally came to an end in the late 1980s and early 1990s. This period was marked by important changes in leadership, new ideas about peace and cooperation, and a series of events that showed the world it was possible to move beyond conflict. The end of the Cold War was not sudden. It was the result of many complex factors working together over time.
One of the most important leaders during this time was Mikhail Gorbachev, who became the head of the Soviet Union in 1985. Gorbachev introduced new policies called glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, to try to reform the Soviet system. He wanted to make the government more transparent and the economy more efficient. These changes helped reduce tensions with the West and opened the door to more peaceful relations.
Gorbachev's willingness to talk and cooperate with the West was very different from previous Soviet leaders. He worked closely with US Presidents Ronald Reagan and later George H.W. Bush to negotiate arms reduction agreements and reduce the risk of nuclear war. The famous Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces INF Treaty, signed in 1987, was a major step that eliminated many nuclear missiles from both sides and showed real progress in ending the arms race.
At the same time, Eastern Europe, which had been controlled by the Soviet Union through communist governments, began to demand change. People in countries like Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Romania started pushing for freedom and democracy. In 1989, a wave of peaceful revolutions swept through these countries, breaking the power of communist parties and opening the door to new governments and new relationships with the West.
One of the most famous moments of this period was the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989. The wall had stood for nearly 30 years, dividing East and West Berlin, symbolizing the division of Europe and the Cold War itself. When the East German government announced that citizens could cross freely, thousands of people gathered to celebrate, tearing down the wall piece by piece. This event became a powerful symbol of the end of division and the hope for unity.
The Soviet Union itself faced growing problems, economic difficulties, political unrest, and nationalist movements in various republics made it difficult for the central government to keep control. In 1991, several republics declared independence, and the Soviet Union officially dissolved in December of that year. This marked the end of the Cold War and the emergence of new independent countries, including the Russian Federation, Ukraine, and the Baltic states.
The end of the Cold War brought many positive changes. It reduced the threat of nuclear war and allowed former enemies to work together in new ways. NATO and Russia began to cooperate, and international organizations like the United Nations played a larger role in promoting peace and security. People in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union gained more freedoms and opportunities than they had in decades.
However, the legacy of the Cold War is complicated. Many conflicts and problems that began during the Cold War still affect the world today. Some regions, like the Korean Peninsula, remain divided and tense. Nuclear weapons still exist, and new rivalries have replaced the old one between the United States and Russia. Understanding the Cold War's history helps us recognize the dangers of distrust and the importance of dialogue and diplomacy.
The Cold War also influenced culture, politics, and international relations for generations. It shaped how countries view power, alliances, and security. It inspired art, literature, film, and music that reflect the fears and hopes of the era. Learning about the Cold War helps us see the world as it was and better understand how it became the world we live in today.
In summary, the end of the Cold War was not just the collapse of a political system, but the beginning of a new chapter in global history. It showed that even long-lasting conflicts can be resolved through negotiation, reform, and peaceful change. The world learned valuable lessons about the dangers of nuclear weapons, the costs of rivalry, and the importance of cooperation.
As we look back on the Cold War, it is important to remember both the struggles and the achievements. The Cold War was a time of great tension and fear, but also a time of incredible scientific progress, cultural exchange, and the desire for peace. It reminds us that history is complex and that even during difficult times, hope and change are always possible.
In our final section, we will reflect on the overall meaning of the Cold War for today's world. We will discuss how the lessons of the Cold War can help us understand current global challenges and how we can work toward a more peaceful future. Stay with us for the conclusion of this journey through one of the most important periods in modern history.
As we reach the end of our journey through the Cold War, it is important to consider how this nearly half-century-long conflict continues to influence our world today. The Cold War was more than just a political or military struggle. It was a battle of ideas, values, and visions for how societies should be governed and how people should live. The echoes of that time still shape international relations, global security, and even daily life across many countries.
One of the most lasting impacts of the Cold War is the continued presence of nuclear weapons and the challenges they bring. The world learned during this period just how dangerous and destructive nuclear arms can be. Efforts such as arms control treaties, non-proliferation agreements, and diplomatic negotiations continue today because of the lessons learned during the Cold War. The threat of nuclear war may have lessened, but it has not disappeared.
The Cold War also shaped the way countries form alliances and partnerships. Organizations like NATO were created to provide security against the Soviet threat, and while the original enemy no longer exists, NATO still plays an important role in international defense and cooperation. Similarly, Russia's relationship with the West is deeply influenced by Cold War history, with trust sometimes fragile and political tensions continuing to arise.
In many regions of the world, the divisions created or deepened during the Cold War still affect politics and society. The Korean Peninsula remains divided, with North Korea continuing to be a major global concern due to its nuclear program and isolation. Eastern Europe and the former Soviet republics have faced ongoing struggles as they transition to new political and economic systems. Understanding this history is key to making sense of current events.
The Cold War also impacted technology and culture in ways that continue to resonate. The space race, which we discussed earlier, not only advanced human knowledge, but also inspired generations to pursue science and exploration. Meanwhile, Cold War-era propaganda, art, music, and literature reflect the hopes, fears, and conflicts of the time. Studying these cultural works helps us appreciate how deeply the Cold War touched people's lives.
The Cold War teaches us important lessons about the dangers of mistrust, fear, and division. When countries see each other only as enemies, misunderstandings and conflicts become more likely. The Cold War was a time when fear often led to suspicion, and suspicion led to actions that increased tension. Today, many leaders and thinkers use the Cold War experience as a reminder to seek dialogue, diplomacy, and peaceful solutions.
At the same time, the Cold War showed how competition can drive innovation and progress. While the rivalry was often dangerous and destructive, it also pushed people to develop new technologies, explore new frontiers, and challenge old ideas. This balance between conflict and cooperation, competition and peace, continues to influence global relations and development today.
Another important aspect to remember is the human side of the Cold War. Millions of people lived their lives under the shadow of this conflict, facing fear, uncertainty, and sometimes loss. Whether in the United States, the Soviet Union, or countries caught in between, individuals had hopes, dreams, and struggles. Their stories remind us that history is made not only by leaders and armies, but by everyday people.
Looking forward, the Cold War encourages us to think about how we approach global challenges in the 21st century. Issues like climate change, terrorism, global health, and technological change require cooperation among nations. The Cold War's lessons about the costs of division and the benefits of dialogue are more important than ever as the world faces complex problems that no country can solve alone.
Finally, the Cold War reminds us to be cautious about the stories we tell and the beliefs we hold about others. Stereotypes, fear, and propaganda during that time made it harder for people to understand one another and build trust. Today, in a world connected by technology but still divided by politics and culture, Remembering the Cold War's lessons can help us work toward empathy, respect, and peace.
As we finish this series, we hope you have gained a clearer understanding of the Cold War's causes, events, and consequences. It was a time of great tension, but also of remarkable achievements and change. Studying the Cold War helps us appreciate the challenges of the past and the possibilities of the future. It encourages us to build a world where conflict is resolved not through fear and weapons, but through cooperation and understanding.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into one of the most important periods in recent history. We encourage you to continue exploring and learning, to share your thoughts with others, and to think critically about the complex world we live in. History is not just about the past, it is a guide for the future.
Don't forget to share your opinions about the Cold War or any part of this podcast in the comments. Where are you listening from? What lessons do you think are most important for today? We love hearing from you and continuing the conversation. Until next time, stay curious and keep learning.